Hey everybody, it's Austin. Welcome to this week's editing video where we're editing photos taken last week. Now, in a minute, I'm going to look different than I do now, and that is because I made a silly mistake as a new YouTuber and I accidentally deleted the introduction that I filmed for this video. So I apologize for that, apologize for some of the incongruencies that you're going to see in this video, and for partway through the video, I made the mistake of not putting down the blinds on a large window that is right here, and it looks like I'm on the surface of the sun. Either way, I felt like I did still want to put this video out because I really liked the photos that we captured the week prior, and I wanted to share the editing process with you all. So if you enjoy this video, please remember to like and subscribe and forgive me this mistake. Hopefully it won't happen again. Either way, this video, we are editing photos that we took last week on a trip to Cedar Creek grist mill, which is down kind of in southern Washington. And we captured, honestly, some of the best fall photos that I've ever taken, and certainly taken since moving here to Washington. So I hope you enjoy the video, hope you enjoy the editing process, and I will see you next week where we'll go out and capture some new photos. Some, again, beautiful fall colors while they last here in Washington. I'll see you then. For our very first image of the day, we have this image right here, and something about this image should be screaming out to anyone viewing it, which is that I have completely blown my highlights in a couple areas. Right up here in this branch in the upper center, right here on these rocks, and over here on the far left-hand side, again on some rocks that were wet and had a lot of reflection coming in on them. And that basically happened because I was at the widest part of the stream, so even though I was in shade and most of the image was actually in shade, the sun was just beaming down on the opposite bank, and as much as I waited, as much as I tried to work my way around it, I was not going to get a solid exposure for most of the image, especially these areas right down here where we have a lot of highly aerated water, which also tends to blow out in long exposures of water. There was just no way that I was going to actually be able to get all of this into one single exposure. And so I had a choice. I basically could take a single frame, or I could try and do an HDR. And anytime that you have a lot of moving objects like leaves working their way down a stream, or leaves that are blowing around in the wind, or branches moving in the wind, doing an HDR is a bit of a risk because either one, you might end up having to hand stitch that image together after the fact, or if you do it automatically, you might actually end up with quite a bit of ghosting happening. And I just frankly didn't feel like doing an HDR. Instead, I felt like I could possibly work my way in the edit around some of these really bright rocks in the background on the opposite bank, and then crop this image as a little bit more of a panoramic, maybe a 16:9 or something like that, to eliminate some of this branch up at the top. And so that is the very first thing that we're going to do with this image, is crop it and bring some of those very, very bright areas back into alignment with the rest of the image from an exposure standpoint. So I'm going to come over here into the crop tool. We're going to set this to be 16:9, which I think is the right aspect ratio for what I'm aiming for. And I'm just going to bring it down so that way we're removing these really blown out bright branches up here at the top. That looks pretty good. And over here on the far left, you can see that there's a rock over here with a reflection on it. And I got to tell you, I don't think that those reflections are recoverable. I think they are fully blown out, whereas these areas in the middle, I think, are just bright, but not completely lost. And so I'm going to crop a little bit more in from the side just to remove that very, very bright reflected rock over on the side. And that actually buys me a little bit more room to bring this image back up. And right about there. Yeah, that looks pretty good to me. We still have the stream. We do have this really unfortunate leaf in the middle here. Maybe I'll end up cloning that out. I'm not really a huge proponent of doing generative fill or removing big things like that, but it is a leaf on a mossy rock. It would be pretty easy to do if that's what you were after. So that looks pretty good. We still have this nice branch up here. The next thing we're going to do is come over to our brush tool, and we're just going to come right over here and select. I have auto mask turned off for this, which is just how I like to do it. I'm going to pick these areas where I have some really, really bright areas of sun hitting the opposite bank, even this rock over here. That looks good. And actually, I think we'll deal with this area right here as well. I'll drop my flow to maybe 50% right here. Not as bright, and I don't want them to have quite the same adjustment that those other areas are going to get. So very coarsely masking this in with auto mask turned off for now. There's even a couple leaves right here. Again, 50% brush will help a lot to bring these back with the rest of the image. There we go. And right here. And now I'm going to go into the erase tool, and I like to have the auto mask turned on for erase. I just find auto mask usually doesn't get it right when I'm adding a brush, but it does a really good job when I'm removing a brush. So coming in here again, I have my flow set to about 75% on the erase, and I'm just removing this brush from anywhere that has a lot of shadow. And it's okay if a little bit remains, but I'm actually going to be taking my exposure down probably by a full stop here in these really bright areas. And I don't want to make these shadows a full stop darker. Just cleaning it up a tiny, tiny bit. It's okay if there's a few remnants hanging out. This area is fine just as it is, but let's go over here to these rocks. Looking good. This side of the rock certainly doesn't need it. Right here doesn't need it. And these areas right here, we're also going to clean up. Again, we don't want to take these dark shadows and turn them pitch black when we're doing that exposure adjustment. Okay, that looks pretty good. We'll zoom back out, do a fit. And then scrolling down here, we're going to first drop our exposure, like I said. And you can see that that's already working some magic up here. So let's go a full stop down just to see what that looks like. That's pretty close. These areas are actually quite nice. It did help a lot with those leaves in the middle by having a 50% brush. And I think what we're going to do now is just drop our highlights a bit. Yeah, there we go. So by dropping our highlights to about a -35 or so, which actually isn't too terrible, that actually looks really, really good. Now, I'm going to take a quick minute because the sun just started blasting through this window. Give me a minute. Let me turn on some blinds or put some blinds up on the window, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I've put a curtain up over the window. Hopefully it's not blowing out this image on this camera anymore, and that means we can get back to editing this image. So the very next thing we need to do here is this image is slightly not level, which happens a lot. I still use the digital level on my camera, but it just isn't always that accurate. And you can tell that it's not level by looking right up here at this path on the opposite side of the stream. So we're going to very quickly correct that just like this with our cropping tool. And that looks pretty good. I might go back and tweak that. I find myself that I just tweak these things pretty consistently over the course of an entire edit. And I do see we have a really bright branch coming in here through the top now that we've moved things around. And so we might actually, let's open this brush back up really quick and add a little bit to that branch. Just to tame that branch. You can see as I'm adding it in that it's already doing a lot to just tame that branch. I'm going to turn the overlay back on so I can clean up my masking just a little bit here. Just by erasing some of these areas where it bled over the edges and making sure, yeah, that looks pretty good. There we go. Much better. That branch isn't just bright like a lighthouse at the top of my image. So now the very next thing that we're going to do with this image, and I want this to be the case for all the images that we edit today, is I would really like this to have a warm feel to it, but I don't want it to be too warm. And right now it is a bit too warm. And that's because I shoot all of my photos pretty much with a white balance setting of shade. And that's basically just a common place where I tend to start out at, depending on what camera I'm using. And it lets me know that all the images I took on that day are starting at the exact same place white balance wise. And it can just make the editing process, if you're editing many images, a little bit easier because you can apply the same correction to your white balance across all of your images, assuming that you want it to actually have consistency across the entire day. So I'm going to take my white balance and I'm going to drop it. Let's see, that looks pretty good. Maybe about to 5,500. I don't want to take it too cold, but yeah, about 5,500 or so. That's making these greens, the beautiful green moss on these rocks, a little bit more blue, but we don't have blue water or anything like that yet. And the leaves still have a nice warm vibrancy to them. And our job with this image, at least my job, is to accentuate that vibrancy. Scrolling down a little bit more, let's see, let's just generally drop our highlights a little bit, maybe a -25 or 26. I want this image to have a slightly flat look to it, so we'll boost our shadows. We're going to drop our whites just a tad, maybe a -15. And our blacks will go up by, let's see, maybe a +10 or so. I want contrast in the image, but I do want it to be subdued contrast. I don't want it to be, as I've said in other images, like really bitty and just over the top. In general, I want the leaves in this particular image to stand out. I want the image to look warm and inviting, like fall autumnal colors. So scrolling all the way down here to the color grading panel in Lightroom, we have our midtones, our highlights, and our shadows. And in my shadows, I would like a bit more blue. So I'm going to drag this little circle over here to blue. And then a little trick is if you hold down Shift, you'll see a line shows up. And that's because if you don't hold down Shift, as you can see, you can adjust this and it can just drag all over the place a little too freely. But if I hold down Shift, it gives me the ability to focus on the amount that I'm adding and not so much the direction that I'm going, because I've already told it that I want blue by dragging that circle over to the blue area. So we'll just add a little tiny bit. What I'm watching for as I adjust this is my rocks right here, the surface of these rocks. I want them to be slightly blue, just an ever so slight tint, not too much. And that looks pretty good. Coming over here to our midtones and highlights, I'm going to add back some orange. That's going to help these leaves appear more orange and yellow than green. And this branch up here on the top that's quite bright, that's also going to help with that. So we'll start with our midtones and we'll take it over here to something like a nice sunset orange. And again, I'm holding Shift and I'm just going to add a bit. And so if you watch, especially these branches up here, you can really see what this is doing. See what's happening as I add it? We're getting a lot more orange and yellow showing up there, but it's not making the entire image just look like you had your white balance set too warm. And that's because our rocks are still staying nice and blue because they are in shadow. So I think we'll actually leave it about there and we'll do something quite similar with our highlights. This is probably going to affect mostly these guys right out here and maybe some of these bright areas like our water. Let's see what happens. It's always a good idea to take it a little bit too far just so you can see what's happening like I'm doing right now. It's not present, it's present. It's not present, it's present. So it's really doing most of its work right out here in this part of the image and actually on some of these leaf tips out here and over here. So of course we're not going to max it out like that, but we will leave it a little bit, maybe at like a 20 on the saturation side of things. You can see right there, that's color grading turned off. And now we bring it back. There we go. Toggle back and forth. You can see that that added a lot more contrast between these greens and the yellows and the color of our rocks. So that is a step in the right direction. I think as we scroll down, I do want a little bit of a vignette on this image. Something like maybe a -10. Totally up to you. That's personal preference on how much you want the viewer's eyes to be focused towards the middle of the image. And if I come over here, we'll go back to our curves. I'm going to just add a little bit in the lights. What I'm watching for here is this is affecting mostly these leaves right here and coming down into the middle. And so again, if you crank it, you can see what's going to happen, right? I don't want it this contrasty, but I think something like maybe a +25 or so actually looks pretty good. And actually, you know what? Let's bring that down to like a -5 or +15. We'll probably adjust this a little bit more, but I do want to make a global exposure adjustment on this image as well. We'll take our darks, and if we drop those, now all of a sudden the whole scene is looking quite a bit moodier. Something like that. And our shadows, if we increase them, then we go a little bit more towards a flat image. You flatten out your shadows just a little bit, or if you drop them, all of a sudden the image becomes just way, way too contrasty. So I'm going to leave our shadows maybe at a +15. I do want contrast again, but I want it to be subdued. And our highlights, I actually think it's okay for us to bring some highlights in here. Again, maybe a +15. That's basically the only highlights left in this image are either the area down here by the water and these leaves. And we're going to actually probably change the white balance on this area of the water in just a little bit, make it a little bit more cool. So coming back up here, again, I said I would do a coarse exposure adjustment because it is a little bit too dark. And that's mostly because, as you've seen in previous videos, I was really exposing for this water right here in the lower left. I didn't want to blow that out. So yeah, it looks like we're about half a stop off or so. The more that I look at this image, the more that I'm thinking that I want a bit more contrast than where I am right now. Come back to our main image and maybe reintroduce a little bit of contrast. We'll do that with our slider for starters. Yeah, okay, that's looking good. So about a +30 is what it needed. My idea of making this a bit of a flatter image just wasn't panning out, and that's okay. editing is a live process and we are doing it live right here. So it's okay for your ideas for an image to change as you process that image. The other thing that I'm noticing is that I still think actually that the top bit of this image, especially the midground where the sun was really hitting these rocks, is just a bit too bright. So let's see what happens if I come over and apply a linear gradient. So let's see what happens if I drop my exposure just a bit, or more specifically, let's just drop our highlights. Maybe a -25, which is quite a bit. Brought it a little bit closer to what I was thinking. Yeah, so this is without, this is with. That's kind of the flatness in this image that I was talking about that I want. It's just a nice, flat, even exposure. I don't want the midground to be so bright that you just instantly fall into it visually. I do want your eyes to kind of pay equal attention to these leaves down here in the foreground as well. I don't really see anything that I feel like is missing from the image. It is really, really green and vibrant as it sits. And as you can see, I haven't added any vibrancy. Let's try and do a color mask. This may not pan out, but if I come over here to color range and I make a selection, again, maybe on these rocks, let's select over here. Let's see what happens, what's being selected. That looks pretty good. It looks like it didn't necessarily select our leaves, which is what we want. And let's see, if we come over here and we drop our saturation. So let's take that and maybe we'll go down to like a -30, something like that. That looks much better, I think. Desaturating an image can always be a little bit of a trap. You do want to be careful, but I think as a whole, I'm actually really happy with that. By reducing the saturation on the rocks and in the water, those leaves are popping even more now, and I didn't have to increase their saturation at all. This is just talking about the relative impact of different colors on the image as a whole. Even the greens, I think, are not at this point overly saturated, and we haven't added any saturation at all. This is pretty much what it was like on the day of filming. The only thing that I'm really seeing here is if I go back to my brush and I select just a regular brush, I'm going to come over here to the left. We'll make sure our overlay is turned on. And I'm going to paint in this area. We'll have a flow of about 80. And right here where these really bright areas are, these are a little bit too warm right now. I do want the image to look warm, but I don't want it to look that warm. So we'll come over here. We'll do a remove or an erase on our brush. That way we're not affecting these rocks. There we go. And we're just going to adjust the white balance on this area just a tad, maybe a -15 or so. And I might actually desaturate this particular area just a tad. Yeah, like a -9. I want the water to have a nice cool look to it. It doesn't need to be blue like some other images I've edited recently, but I didn't want it to look so yellow like the rest of the image. Just giving it a final once over. And I think the only thing that I see is right over here. I'm going to grab a brush. We talked about this earlier, but this bright area of water, I did deal with this rock, but this water itself is also just a little bit too bright for me. So I'm going to select this area. I'm bleeding purposely a little bit onto these rocks so they are also a bit too bright for my liking. We're going to clean that up with the erase tool. At this point, you know the drill. Just removing it from the shadows there. There we go. And I think we just got to drop our exposure here. Yeah, it doesn't take very much. Maybe we'll drop our shadows just a tad, or is that our highlights? Yeah, our highlights. There we go. Put our shadows back. So I'm basically just looking right here where my cursor is. Some of those reflections on the water were a little bit too bright and drawing my eye off to the left. But now when I look at this image, my eye is going straight to these leaves in the middle and just following this beautiful scattering of golden yellow fall leaves all the way up through the image, up until I see this branch, which kind of takes me out of the image. Normally during like a regular edge patrol, when you check the edges of an image, that branch, you might see it and think, oh, that's just ruining the image. But I actually quite like it. It gives you the sense that the canopy, the overstory in this image, was really hanging down quite low to the water, and that's exactly how it is. And that branch is going to feature very heavily in our next image, which we're going to edit right now. As I continued to struggle with that really bright sunlight on the opposite bank of Cedar Creek, I ended up turning my camera vertically and taking portrait orientation images basically for the rest of the day. And that was a really, really valuable decision because it allowed me to focus almost exclusively on the right-hand bank of Cedar Creek, which was still in shade and for the most part would remain so, while the entire left side was basically completely getting blown out by some very, very bright sunlight, with the exception of the 1 or 2 clouds that would pass overhead. And that is how we landed on this image. Now, the very first thing that I want you to notice about this image is that we have a very prominent foreground element with these leaves on these rocks right here. And these are probably about a foot or maybe 2 feet in front of my lens. I was shooting on a crop sensor, but still with a very wide angle lens, the RF 14-35 f4L. And what that means is that the final image that we end up with, the one that you're going to see in last week's video and at the end of this video, is actually a focus stacked image. We're only going to edit 1 frame of it. But what I want you to know is that when we edit this image, I'm going to take the exact same settings and I'm going to apply them to 2 other images. This first image, I focused very much on our foreground subjects right here, these beautiful leaves on the rocks. The second image that I took was focused on our midground, and the third image that I took was focused on this branch coming out of the upper right-hand corner of the image. And then what I'm going to do in Adobe Photoshop is blend those images so that way I have sharpness throughout this entire exposure. Now, I did take this image at f14, as you can see right up here on the screen, and so I still have plenty of depth of field. I might even be able to get away with a single exposure, but I took those extra frames, and focus stacking is a really good insurance policy against any kind of issues that you might get by squeezing that aperture down to like f22 or something really crazy like that. So as we edit this image, again, I'm going for a nice, really warm feel, but the very first thing that I'm going to do is deal with any kind of discrepancies in terms of exposure. And the very first thing that I see are these branches up here, again, on the opposite bank of Cedar Creek. We're going to deal with that with maybe a linear gradient. We'll see. I don't need to be super, super selective here. I do not want to affect this branch over here on the right-hand side. So we'll back that linear gradient off. And we also don't want to affect too much of our midground over here, but I think that amount of bleed is okay. And let's see, if I just drop my highlights just a tad, maybe a -20, I always find that with highlight adjustments, I have to be pretty heavy-handed just to be able to bring them down. And maybe we'll do maybe a 1/4 of a stop or so. Yeah, something like that. That looks good. Now, it is slightly brighter, but it's certainly a lot darker than our foreground elements, so it's not like your eye is instantly going to get drawn up into that upper left-hand corner. And actually, as a whole, this doesn't look too bad from an exposure standpoint. I do want to darken this foreground just a little bit, these leaves down here, because again, I don't want the viewer's eyes always going to the brightest part, which would be basically this extreme foreground. I would rather them fall on these leaves right here, and then continue your journey up through the image until you hit that branch, which again carries you out of the image to the top right corner. So let's do another linear gradient. Sometimes linear gradients are just a bit too heavy-handed and they affect parts of the image that you don't want, but I find that adding them, especially towards the edges of a frame, much like a vignette, that's okay to do and it doesn't detract from the image as a whole. So we'll drop our exposure just a tad, maybe again a 1/4 of a stop down here, and I'm actually going to drop my blacks here a little bit more because I really do want this rock to have kind of a really slick blackness to it. So if I drop my blacks, maybe a -10, let's see what happens with our shadows, just ever so slightly on those shadows, maybe a -5. That looks good. Now in this image, the leaves are nice and bright, but the rocks themselves are not. And as we move up in the image, we're pretty much left with nice bright leaves throughout the rest of the frame. I'm not really sure that this needs any leveling adjustments, maybe a slight crop like that. Let's see if I reverse, redo, reverse, redo. Yeah, slight leveling. Again, I was using the digital level on this camera on the EOS R7. It's not always accurate, especially with ultra wide angle lenses and where you don't have a good horizon. It can be difficult to get this stuff completely nailed in the field. So a slight twist in our framing. And I'm actually, again, going to drag our frame up a bit because I do really care about making sure we include all of this beautiful mossy branch in the upper right corner of the image. And we had a little bit of spare room with that rock down here in the very, very bottom of the image. This image is way too warm, so we'll back it off again, maybe 5800 or so. looks pretty good to me. And now I think we're in a good place to really focus on the rest of the image. And I think the very first thing that I'm going to do, I think we'll adjust our highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, but then we're going to just slap some color grade on this image right away and let that kind of drive the rest of the edit. Take our highlights and we're going to drop those just a tad. You will see that that is affecting the branches up here in the upper left and affecting our leaves, but we're going to bring a lot of that back in just a minute. Take our shadows and bring those back. Just like our last image, I don't want this to be flat, but I also don't want it to be too contrasty. Somewhere in the middle. A nice, soft, warm light kind of traveling throughout the entire image is what I'm looking for. We'll come down here to dehaze, and we'll just mess with this for a minute. So if I crank the dehaze to the right, that is making it pretty contrasty, pretty inky in some of those really, really dark shadows. And if I bring it all the way to the left, that is just way, way too soft. But I do think for this particular image, we'll add a little bit of dehaze, like a +10, and we'll kind of maybe walk that back a little bit later, or let that take a little bit of weight when we consider how we're going to affect our contrast in this image. We'll keep going past our curves for the moment, and that's because I do want to apply a grade. So I'm going to hold Shift, and I'm going to drag this guy right over here. So again, I'm bringing in some nice sunset orangey yellow color, something like that. Very, very minimal. That's only a 13 being added. And then again, up here in our highlights. Now, as I affect these highlights, you can see this is max, this is nothing. Max, nothing. You can see it's doing a lot to our leaves, both here in the foreground and up here. And I do want those leaves to be nice and golden color, but I don't want them to be orange, right? Not, at least not that orange. So we'll maybe walk it to like a +15 or so. And I think that's going to work mostly because I'm going to, again, desaturate other parts of this image, which you'll see in just a minute. We'll come over here and we're going to bring some blues back into our shadows. And what you're seeing as I do that, if I max it out, obviously it looks terrible right now, but look down here, look at the areas where it's really making a big impact, and keep an eye on those areas like here on the rocks and here in the water as I make more subtle adjustments. Always a good idea to just pin it down to max, get an idea of what parts of an image you're affecting, and then walk it back to something more reasonable. So I'm back at 0. And if I add just a bit of blue, again, about a 15 or so is doing a lot for us. It's not turning our water blue, but it is helping those rocks a little bit more, not be so kind of brown colored. There's still a lot of warmth to this image, which is great. That's what I'm going for. But I think if we go up here, again, to our saturation, I think we're going to drop our saturation a little bit, maybe in some of the greens, maybe. Actually, I don't think it needs it. These are not very saturated to begin with. Let's look at our luminance, though. If I take our greens and I drop their luminance, what does that do? Not very much. It's affecting these areas up here, and it's affecting some of these areas here on the rock, but it's not actually doing that much. If we take our aqua, again, not very much. Our blues, not very much. What I'm looking for here is to try and see what is going to give me a similar effect to that last image of desaturating the water and desaturating the reflective areas of these rocks. Last time we did that through a color mask, or a color range mask, and so let's try and do that again. I'm going to select this area of water right here, and that doesn't look bad. We are selecting a lot of greens. There's a lot of reflected green light in that water. And so I might actually refine it down just a tad, something like that. We can always adjust that in a minute. But let's just come down here and let's see what happens if we drop our our saturation just a tad. Again, I'll crank it. That is fully desaturated, and that's obviously too much. If we fully saturate it, that's obviously too much. But I think we're actually, again, going to be pretty heavy-handed with this, and we'll go to about a -30. We are being very, very heavy-handed with this desaturation tool, but we're applying it to a very limited area of the image, really just these really dark blues that are occurring here on the rocks and here in the water. So that looks good. That is allowing the golden leaves to stand out a bit more and bring some warmth to the image in their own way. And let's do some basic curve adjustments. This is again going to add contrast back into the image, and we're going to be pretty conservative here, pretty gentle. So we'll take our lights. I would like these leaves to look nice and bright, and it looks like if I crank it, of course, that's too much. We'll do a general exposure adjustment in just a second. But I think about a plus 15 or so looks pretty good. We may actually even darken this middle part of the frame. It's almost too bright for my taste. We'll take our darks, and we could increase them to flatten the image as a whole. Or if we decrease them, ooh, that is way, way too contrasty. So I think we will actually flatten the image just a tad, maybe by going up to a plus 15, but I still want my dark areas to remain dark. So we'll drop our shadows just a tad, maybe a minus 10. That looks good. That has actually introduced a bit more contrast up here in the upper right-hand corner where we have these nice mossy green branches and a bit more contrast in this nice slippery rock down here. If you watched last week's video, you know that I literally almost slipped and dropped, well, not my camera, but myself and the camera I was holding on these rocks. It was really, really slippery. So that's looking pretty good. I think at this point, there's not very much left for us to do. Let's look at that overall exposure adjustment. If I increase the exposure like this, then this foreground again just becomes too bright, and this area through here becomes too bright. And I would just have to go through and apply a brush and bring those areas back. So I think I'm gonna leave it as just a flat, straight exposure. And the reason why I pretty much got this exposure, how I was able to get this exposure how I wanted it, is because, as you can see, we don't have very much aeration happening in the water here, and so I didn't need to adjust my exposure for that. I was able to really just focus my exposure and how I was metering the scene for the image as a whole, and not for one particular area of the image, like sometimes you have to when you have really aerated, fast-moving water. So I think as a whole, that looks pretty good. Let's take one look at what a vignette would or would not do to this image. I'm okay if a vignette wants to make this foreground a little bit darker, and maybe this corner, and especially up here where these branches are still quite bright. So we'll introduce a little bit of vignette, and let's see what that does. So if I go from roughly 0 to like a minus 20, again, that's pushing it a bit too far, but a little bit of vignette is actually helping, I would say, quite a bit. So maybe a minus 10. Yeah, I'm quite happy with that. I think a minus 10 vignette is exactly what this image needed. It darkened these branches up here, and it actually kind of made their yellow color a little bit richer. And down here in the bottom left, it kind of dulled some of the reflections that we had on this rock. And as a whole, I think I am very happy with this image. The leaves are nice and bright, the greens are still nice and green, but the overall image has a really nice warmth to it, and I'm happy with it. So we're going to move on to our third image of this video. I can't remember at the intro if I said 2 images or 3 images, but we're going to do 3 because the last one I think I'm really, really happy with. So here's our third image of the day, and I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with this image because I really, really like the leaves that are down here in the foreground of this image, but I also am quite torn on the branch. That branch that was extending out over Cedar Creek very much became the hero of all, or at least 2 of these 3 images, and I was just really attracted to it. I wanted to find the right angle to photograph it, and I struggled, if I'm being honest, because in this image, the branch takes up a lot more of the frame, but it's kind of difficult to establish the branch against that background and to have it stand out. And so I think the very first thing that we're going to do on this image is get the water back to the level that we want it to be, still dark, but not black. And then I'm going to go in probably with a linear gradient and try and darken the upper half of the image where you have that branch. So we'll come up here to our exposure tool and we'll increase things. Let's see how far we're going to take this. I think something like 3/4 of a stop. If I had exposed for the water, it would have been about a stop or so overexposed on this branch up top because the sun was hitting that branch. And so we'll bring it back down to 3/4 of a stop, and we're still going to treat that branch a little bit. So we'll come up here and do for now, a linear gradient. We'll deal with the entire top half of the image. I'm holding shift, and that's allowing me to keep this as a nice vertical gradient. It's also going to give me a reference point to see if I need to level this image at all, which it looks okay. Maybe a slight twist could be needed, but we'll deal with that in a minute if needed. And I'm going to just drag down my exposure by about 0.2 of a stop or so, 0.18, somewhere around there. I'm going to drop our highlights about -15. What I'm watching for here are these leaves, but especially over here at the tip. We might actually come in with a brush and deal with these very, very bright leaves out here at the tip of this branch. So let me make that highlight adjustment a little bit less aggressive. And then we'll go in and we'll brush in a minute and add a little bit more to the tip of that branch. We're also going to need to deal with a very bright area up here in the upper left-hand corner. So we'll grab another linear gradient, position it about as such. And you can see we're not really affecting anything down here in the water, which is great. And we're going to drop our exposure here. I'm going to be pretty heavy-handed. Yeah, maybe about, again, 3/4 of a stop or so. Very, very heavy-handed. I might even drop some of my shadows and my blacks up here. And now looking at this image, there are two things I'm seeing. There's a very bright area here and some very bright leaves right here. So we'll come in here with a brush just to be a little bit more detailed. We'll zoom in. And we're going to just paint in. I have a flow set to about 80. I'm actually going to take my flow and set it to 50 and just blend the edges here a little bit with just a little bit of that mask. We'll go back to our erase tool. We have it set to a flow of 75, and we're going to clean this up just a tad. So I don't want any of this affecting the shadows. We'll deal with those later if we need. Not too much on these rocks, and certainly not up here on these greens, which we already applied a linear gradient to. So we only really want this branch and the immediate area right here on its edges to be affected. And then of course, this very bright area down here, and you can kind of just tell exactly where the sun was hitting on this branch because the difference in exposure is substantial. Sometimes the light works out, sometimes you can wait for a cloud to pass overhead, and sometimes you just need to deal with it after the fact because there's no reason to sit there, have a beautiful composition, and then just leave without taking a photo because all the conditions didn't perfectly align. You can always come back when conditions are better, but by all means, take the image, take it home, see what you can do with it, and have fun with it, right? So I'm going to take this and we're going to drop our exposure. And what I'm looking for is I want these leaves to be about the same brightness as these leaves up here. And it looks like just over half a stop is doing it. Let's see if we drop our highlights just a tad. I don't even think it needs it. This area on shore is still a little bright. So we will do one more brush just to be really quite aggressive on these grasses right here. My flow, I think, is still set to 50. Yep, just about. And so I'm not even going to worry about cleaning this brush up very much. We're just going to come right in and drop the exposure on that. There we go. So that might seem like a very detailed, nitpicky thing to go in and brush, but on the flip side, if I didn't do that, that entire area of that tip of the branch and the bright grass underneath is the very first place that your eye as the viewer would go, and that's not what I want. The subject here is the branch and the leaves on the rocks, not a random patch of grass in the background. So over here, we've already dealt with our exposure. Our white balance is pretty dialed in at this point. I think we're going to play it pretty safe by, again, treating our highlights maybe a -15, increase our shadows. Our whites will drop just a tad, maybe a -10. Blacks will increase for now. We'll bring some contrast back later if needed. I think we're going to do some of that desaturation that we did on the last two images to really make those leaves pop. And over here in dehaze, let's see. I think the tiniest bit of dehaze might be warranted here, like a +5 or so. That's going to help that branch really stand out against the background, and it's doing some really nice things here to this moss on the rock. Let's definitely increase the luminance, maybe a +10. Yeah, about a +10, maybe a +12 on our leaves. That's helping these leaves really pop against those rocks. And again, as I desaturate those rocks in just a minute, this whole image is going to change. It's going to become much more contrasty, at least in a color sense. We'll go back here and I'm going to do a similar color grading as before. Pretty conservative. We're doing a +14, nice orangey yellows on our mids. That's going to affect those leaves down here in the foreground. And then our highlights, this is especially going to affect this branch up here. So let's see what that looks like. Why don't I add, yeah, right now we're at a +16, and I'm going to swing it just a little bit so you can see what it's doing. As I move towards red, you can see how these leaves are understandably turning nice and red, but that is way, way too red. And if I swing it real green, you're going to see how they are now just really, really green. So coming back somewhere to the middle, again, kind of that sunset orange color, we'll leave it at about a +16. Our shadows, I think for this one, we'll do something very similar to the other two. We'll just bring a little bit of blue back in there, not too much, something like a 15 on the saturation scale. I should say, when I'm saying 15, 16, things like that, as you are in the color grading panel here on Lightroom, you can actually see these numbers popping up right up here. So next to this name shadows, if I come down here, you can see exactly where I'm at. So the hue is at 238, the saturation is at 14, and the luminosity is at 0 for our shadows. And there are different numbers for the highlights and for the midtones. So pay attention to those. Scrolling down a little bit, I know that I want a vignette on this image. I may even do an additional linear gradient across the bottom of this image to help lift the viewer's eyes up towards the middle of the frame. But this vignette is going to do a lot for this really bright upper left-hand corner and for these leaves down here in the lower right. So we may actually be pretty heavy-handed with this. Let's see. Yeah, I think we will. We'll do about a -15. So let me turn this vignette off, on, off, on. We're not really affecting this leaf over here, which is great. That's one of our main foreground subjects. We're not really affecting any of these mosses over here. There's a nice transition from dark at the edges to nice bright green moss in the middle of the image, but we are definitely toning down these leaves over here and this kind of bright corner up here, which is basically where the sun was just blasting through the upper canopy. And so that looks pretty good, but as I mentioned, I want to do a couple things here. First, I want to see if there's anything I can do to this branch. It's already very much the focus of the image, at least in the upper half of the image, and it looks pretty good. We may adjust things a little bit, we may not, but I definitely want to do some desaturation, especially down here, to make these rocks a little bit darker, and maybe even a brush just down here to reduce some of the browns that we're getting in this water. This is because I was using a circular polarizer. Circular polarizers are great because they allow you to cut down on reflections in the water, but they can also lead to you seeing the silty, mucky bottom of a stream, or in this case a creek, which I'm not really a huge fan of. The first of these things that I'm going to do is that color range desaturation mask. So I've picked that right here. I'm going to come over and I'm just going to grab anywhere on these rocks. How about right here where we've got some reflected light happening? That looks pretty good. You can see our leaves are not in this mask at all. And we may refine it down just a tad. So we'll come up here to refine. Maybe something like that to maybe a 40. And if I come down here and desaturate just a tad, I'm going to crank it so you can see what's happening. That's what happens if we completely desaturate this image. And to be honest, I'm not a fan of selective color images, but this actually looks kind of cool. I'm not going to do it, but I don't know. Under the right circumstances, this is actually a pretty cool image, I think. Instead, we're going to just walk it back. We'll go back to 0 so you can see what it looks like currently. And then we'll just be really gradual with it. Maybe a -30, which if I remember is about where we landed with the other images. So we are being nice and consistent here. The next thing I'm going to do is try and deal with some of these browns down here. We could do that with desaturating, but really I think the very first thing we need to do is just reduce the exposure on some of this water where our circular polarizer allowed the camera to see straight through the reflections and right down again to that very silty, mucky bottom. So we'll grab a brush. We're going to make sure that our masking, per my own preference, is turned off for auto masking. And we'll clean that up in just a minute. So we're going to be really coarse. I'm not going to take this brush over here into these very dark areas because I don't need to make those areas pitch black. I don't want to lose detail in those areas. I'm just working on this particular area of water right here. And we'll clean it up by zooming in. And just make sure that we're not affecting any of these rocks. It is actually really tricky right now with this masking because these rocks are also a bit brown. And they're in basically the same exposure space as that area under the water. So even the auto mask is getting a little bit confused here. But that's looking pretty good. And of course, we will use auto mask. We're going to zoom way in. We do not want to be dropping the exposure on this beautiful leaf here. That is one of our main foreground elements. So I'm going to crank my flow up to 100% and make sure that we are completely clean of a mask on the majority of this leaf. A little bit towards the edges is okay. If you don't have some feathering at the edges of a mask, it can lead to some really artificial borders. But I think that's probably pretty good. Make sure we're not getting anything on the edges of this leaf here. And we're looking pretty clean. There's a little bit hitting here, but I think that'll be okay. It'll help blend it. That's looking pretty good. Maybe I'll bring this to about 75% flow and just clean up the edge of this rock. We don't need that rock getting any darker. A little bit of feathering here at the edge of the water is totally fine. Okay, so I'm going to stay zoomed in on this just for the moment, and we're going to scroll down and we'll see what happens if I turn off the overlay and just drop our exposure a tad. By dropping the exposure a little bit, and let's see what happens if we make it a little bit cooler. There we go, maybe a -15 or so. There we go. Now that brown silt on the bottom of the creek is a little bit darker, harder to see, there's less color coming off of it, and what color is coming off of it we've made a bit cooler, which just helps it blend in a little bit more with the surrounding rocks. So I think as a whole, that's looking pretty good. Let's adjust our main curves here and see if the image would benefit from this. Looks like it would a little bit. By increasing our lights, the leaves are now really popping against those rocks, and this branch has absolutely become a main subject of this image. It's also helping quite a bit with this area of moss right here on the rock. And if we adjust our blacks, by subtracting blacks, this image got real dark real quick. That is just way too heavy-handed. Let's see what happens if we maybe give them a +5 or even leave them as is. Let's see. If I drop my shadows, yeah, I think that's what we're going for. So we'll drop our shadows by maybe a -13 or even a -10. Yeah, -10. Nice conservative adjustments. Let's see if our highlights need any adjustment. There's basically no highlights left in this image except for some of our leaves. So we'll be very, very modest and give that maybe a +5. The only thing that I can see that this image needs is there are a couple leaves here on our mossy rock that are just a little bit too bright. So we're going to come in here, we're going to do a brush. You could also do this with a luminance range mask, but you would have to then box it in so much to not affect other leaves in the image. A brush is definitely the right way to go here. Be really coarse here because again, we're going to clean it up as I always do. This way we're selecting leaves that had water on them, which was reflecting light at just the right way to sneak past my circular polarizer. And then of course we'll go to the erase tool, flow is set to 75, auto mask is turned on, and we're just gonna clean up our edges here. That's looking good. We don't have to be super precise with our erasing. That is the whole point of the auto mask tool. And I'm not expecting to even drop the exposure of these. So I'm not too worried if we have some shadows over here that are falling into our mask. This should be, for the most part, just a highlights adjustment. So I'll turn off our overlay, drop our highlights. There we go. So about a -40 on those leaves. They were really, really sneaking past that circular polarizer there. Overall, I am really happy with this image. The leaves are nice and vibrant and golden. The rocks look as slippery as they really were with that beautiful green moss. And finally, after 3 images, I feel like I was able to take that branch overhanging Cedar Creek and turn it into a main subject of an image and to do it justice. I really worked on these really hard on the day, thought a lot about my composition, and it was a ton of fun. If you have anything like this, a creek, a little tiny babbling brook going, by in a local park, I would really recommend that you get out there and photograph them. Even if you don't have fall colors, there are always leaves hanging around, there's always moss, and there's always something to shoot. So let me know down in the comments what you think about this image or about this video. Do you want these videos to be done in a different way? I know that they're a little bit long, but I feel like I'm being authentic with you all. You're seeing these images edited from start to finish, and I don't know very many channels on YouTube that do something like that. So let me know what you think down in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.